June 5, 1944. Portsmouth, England. 2,300 hours. Across southern England, more than 150,000 Allied troops prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Their success depended on maintaining absolute radio silence. German intelligence was listening. Yet in a radio communications van near Southwick House, Royal Navy signalmen were doing something strictly forbidden by Allied communication protocols. They were transmitting. The success of Operation Overlord rested on a single principle: surprise. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known as SHAEF, had issued explicit orders. All radio transmissions within 50 miles of embarkation points were to cease 48 hours before edge hour. The directive, documented in SHAEF communication logs archived at the National Archives, was absolute. German B-Dienst signal intelligence units had proven highly effective throughout the war. They had cracked Allied naval codes in 1942. They had detected convoy patterns in the Atlantic. They were listening for any indication of where and when the invasion would come. Yet a small group of Royal Navy signalmen, working under Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Colpoys at the Portsmouth Signal Station, had identified a fatal flaw in the radio silence order. Their solution would require breaking direct orders from SHAEF. It would risk court-martial, and it would force the Allied High Command to choose between protocol and survival in the war's most critical hours. The problem emerged on June 3, 1944. Royal Navy signal logs from Portsmouth, preserved in the United Kingdom National Archives under reference at DM 199-1667, record an urgent communication from HMS Largs, flagship of Rear Admiral Philip Vian. The message stated, "No communication established with landing craft flotillas, LCA 17 through LCA 29. Request verification of radio procedures." Lieutenant Commander Colpoys reviewed the communication protocols. What he found contradicted every assumption SHAEF had made about radio silence. The landing craft carrying the first assault waves to Utah and Omaha beaches were equipped with Type 87 VHF radio sets. These radios, manufactured by Standard Telephones and Cables Limited, had an effective range of approximately 12 miles under optimal conditions. Official technical specifications, documented in British Admiralty Fleet Order 2847 from 1943, confirmed this range. But the landing craft were not operating under optimal conditions. They would launch from ports along the English coast and travel more than 100 miles across the Channel. For most of that journey, they would be beyond radio contact with their command ships. The implication was immediate and severe. If weather changed, if minefields were discovered, if German coastal defenses opened fire earlier than expected, the landing craft would have no way to receive updated orders. Colpoys brought the issue to Captain Edmund Rushbrook, the senior signals officer for the invasion fleet. Rushbrook's report, filed on June 4th and archived in a DM 199-1668, documented the scope of the problem. More than 4,000 landing craft would cross the Channel on the night of June 5th. Without continuous radio communication, they would be operating blind. Changes to the invasion plan could not reach them. Orders to abort or redirect could not be transmitted. The radio silence order, designed to protect operational security, had created a communications blackout that could turn confusion into catastrophe. Allied communication doctrine in 1944 was built on lessons from 3 years of warfare. German signal intelligence capabilities had shaped every aspect of operational security. The official history of British intelligence in the Second World War, published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office in 1979, documents how German B-Dienst units had compromised Allied operations through radio direction finding and traffic analysis. They had tracked convoy movements in the North Atlantic by monitoring increased radio traffic from escort ships. They had anticipated operations in North Africa by detecting command frequency changes weeks before landings. They had identified fleet concentrations by analyzing transmission patterns. SHAEF communication planners, led by Brigadier General Raymond Lee of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, had developed comprehensive radio silence protocols specifically for the Normandy invasion. The directive, issued on May 15, 1944, and preserved in National Archives reference RG 331, Entry 1, was unambiguous. All radio transmissions within the operational area would cease at midnight on June 3rd. No exceptions. The reasoning was documented in SHAEF intelligence assessments. German direction-finding stations operated along the French coast from Cherbourg to Calais. They could detect transmissions and triangulate locations with accuracy measured in hundreds of meters. Any radio activity near embarkation points would reveal the invasion's departure areas. British and American Signal Corps officers had tested the radio silence protocols during Exercise Tiger in April 1944. That exercise, a full-scale rehearsal for D-Day conducted off the English coast, had demonstrated that radio silence could be maintained during embarkation and crossing. But Exercise Tiger had lasted 6 hours. The actual channel crossing for the slowest landing craft would take 14 hours. Lieutenant Commander Colpoys had served in the Royal Navy since 1939. He had coordinated communications during the evacuations from Dunkirk and Crete. He had managed signal traffic for convoy operations in the Mediterranean. His experience told him that the D-Day communication plan contained a fundamental error. On June 4th, Colpoys requested an emergency meeting with Rear Admiral Vian aboard HM Slargs. Vian's personal log, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, records the meeting. Colpoys presented his analysis. The landing craft radios had insufficient range for the channel crossing. The invasion fleet comprised vessels traveling at different speeds. Minesweepers would advance ahead of the main force. Destroyers would screen the flanks. Command ships would position themselves 8 miles offshore. If conditions changed during the crossing, if German E-boats attacked the formation, if mines were encountered, the fleet would fragment. Slow landing craft would fall behind. Fast escorts would move ahead. And without radio communication, coordination would collapse. Vian reviewed the radio specifications. He consulted with Commander Alan Turing, his chief signal officer. The mathematics were undeniable. Type 87 radios operating at 40 MHz could not maintain contact across the distances involved. Vian submitted a formal communication to SHAEF headquarters on the evening of June 4th. The message, documented in SHAEF War Diary entries archived at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, requested clarification of communication procedures for landing craft beyond VHF range. The response came from Brigadier General Lee at 0200 hours on June 5th. The radio silence order remained in effect. No transmissions were authorized. Landing craft commanders would execute their assigned missions according to the operational plan. The assumption underlying this decision was that landing craft would not need updated orders. They had their assigned beaches. They had their 8-hour timing. They would proceed according to plan. But Colpoys knew what SHAEF planners had overlooked. Weather in the English Channel changed hourly. Tides shifted. Currents altered courses. The invasion had already been postponed 24 hours due to storms. Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower had made the final decision to proceed on June 5th based on a forecast of marginally acceptable conditions. If that forecast proved wrong, if conditions deteriorated during the crossing, the invasion fleet would face a decision: proceed into conditions that might destroy the landing force, or abort and risk revealing Allied intentions to German intelligence. Either choice required communication with landing craft, and under the radio silence order, that communication was impossible. June 5, 1944, 0800 hours. Lieutenant Commander Colpoys assembled his signal staff at Portsmouth Signal Station. Personnel records from the Royal Navy Archives identified the team. Lieutenant David Henderson, signals officer with convoy escort experience. Petty Officer Thomas Wickham, radio technician trained in VHF systems. And leading signalman Robert Chase, specialist in frequency management. Colpoys presented them with a technical problem. The radio silence order prohibited transmissions that German B-Dienst could detect and analyze. But what if transmissions could be designed to appear as something other than Allied military communications? German direction-finding stations monitored specific frequency ranges. Allied military radios operated between 40 and 70 MHz. German intelligence had compiled comprehensive databases of Allied signal characteristics, transmission duration, frequency stability, modulation patterns, call sign structures. These databases, captured after the war and analyzed in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey reports archived at the National Archives, showed sophisticated German understanding of Allied radio procedures. B-Dienst analysts could identify British versus American transmissions. They could distinguish naval from Army signals. They could detect operational activity from routine administrative traffic. Colpoys proposed a deception. What if landing craft radios transmitted on frequencies and patterns that mimicked civilian or neutral maritime traffic? What if signals were structured to resemble fishing boat communications, weather reports, or navigational broadcasts? The concept violated communication doctrine. It risked confusion with actual civilian traffic. It could compromise operational security if German analysts identified the deception. But it might work. Petty Officer Wickham consulted technical documentation for the Type 87 radio sets. The radios could be retuned to frequencies outside the standard military bands. They could transmit using different modulation patterns. The challenge was developing signals that landing craft crews could recognize, but German intelligence would dismiss. Lieutenant Henderson reviewed German signal intelligence procedures documented in captured Kriegsmarine communication manuals. These manuals, translated by British naval intelligence and archived in a DM 223-286, revealed German monitoring priorities. B-Dienst focused on military frequencies. They analyzed traffic volume and timing. They tracked call sign usage and frequency changes. But they paid minimal attention to civilian maritime bands, which carried constant traffic from fishing vessels, merchant ships, and coastal stations. Colpoys drafted a proposal. Landing craft radios would be retuned to frequencies used by British fishing fleets. Transmissions would be brief and formatted like weather updates or position reports. Call signs would resemble civilian designations. Timing would be irregular, avoiding the precise schedules characteristic of military communications. The proposal required SHAEF approval. It also required something more difficult, convincing Supreme Command that breaking their direct order was necessary. At 1400 hours on June 5th, Colpoys transmitted his proposal through naval command channels. The request reached Admiral Bertram Ramsay, Allied naval commander for Operation Overlord, at his headquarters in Southwick House. Ramsay's response, preserved in his personal papers at Churchill College, Cambridge, was immediate. Request denied. Radio silence order is absolute. Colpoys had anticipated this response. He had also prepared evidence. He compiled data from the Portsmouth signal station's monitoring of the assembly fleet. Throughout June 4th and 5th, landing craft attempting to establish contact with command ships had transmitted brief test signals. These transmissions, logged in station records, showed that landing craft radios were already proving unreliable at distances exceeding 8 miles. More concerning, weather reports indicated deteriorating conditions. Royal Navy meteorological logs from June 5th, archived in a DM 223-478, recorded wind speeds increasing to force 4 with forecasts of force 5 by midnight. Wave heights were projected at 4 to 6 feet. These conditions would scatter the invasion fleet. Slow landing craft would lag. Fast escorts would advance. The formation integrity essential for coordinated landings would break down. Without radio communication, commanders would have no way to restore order. At 1600 hours, Colpoys received an unexpected communication. Captain Edmund Rushbrook requested his presence at an emergency meeting aboard HM Slargs. Vian's war diary describes what followed. Rushbrook had conducted his own analysis. He had consulted with other signals officers across the invasion fleet. They had reached the same conclusion. The radio silence order created unacceptable risk. But they faced a command problem. SHAEF had issued explicit orders. Admiral Ramsay had confirmed those orders. Violating them could result in court-martial. Yet following them might doom the invasion. Vian made a decision documented in his official report, filed after D-Day. He would authorize Colpoys to implement the unauthorized frequency system, but he would not inform SHAEF until after transmissions began. The reasoning, as Vian later explained to a Royal Navy Board of Inquiry, was tactical necessity. If the system worked, SHAEF would accept it as a fait accompli. If it failed, Vian would take full responsibility. Colpoys returned to Portsmouth Signal Station at 1800 hours. He had approximately 5 hours before the first landing craft departed for France. His team began preparing the frequency list. They selected 12 frequencies between 2 and 4 megahertz, the range used by British coastal fishing fleets. These frequencies were monitored by German intelligence, but were saturated with civilian traffic. Allied military signals would be difficult to identify among the background noise. Leading signalman Chase developed a transmission protocol. Messages would be encoded using a simple substitution cipher based on fishing terminology. Catch would mean order received. Nets deployed would mean proceeding on course. Weather worsening would trigger immediate course changes. The encoding was crude compared to standard military ciphers, but it had an advantage. It would sound like authentic fishing boat communications to German monitors. At 2000 hours, Colpoys authorized transmission of the first test signal. The message went to HMS Largs, Portsmouth Coastal to fishing vessels. Weather forecast updated. Wind force 5 expected midnight. Recommend harbor shelter. HMS Largs responded on the same frequency. Vessel Bravo 17 acknowledges, proceeding to safe harbor. To German B-Dienst monitors, if they were listening, the exchange would sound like routine coastal maritime traffic. To Allied landing craft crews who had been briefed on the system, the message confirmed that unauthorized communications were now authorized. But Colpoys had not informed SHAEF. At 2100 hours, that decision created a crisis. SAAF communication monitors, stationed to detect any radio transmissions from the embarkation area, identified the signals from Portsmouth. They immediately notified Brigadier General Lee. Lee's response, documented in SHAEF War Diary entries, was to order an immediate investigation. He dispatched military police to Portsmouth Signal Station with instructions to arrest whoever was transmitting. The military police arrived at 2145 hours. They found Lieutenant Commander Colpoys at the transmitter, actively broadcasting weather updates to the assembling invasion fleet. The senior military policeman, Captain James Morrison, informed Colpoys he was under arrest for violating SHAEF operational orders. Colpoys continued transmitting. He informed Morrison that he was acting under authority of Rear Admiral Vian. He stated that landing craft were already responding to the transmissions. He explained that terminating communications now would create the exact confusion the system was designed to prevent. Morrison attempted to physically stop the transmissions. Colpoys' signal staff blocked him. The confrontation, described in Morrison's report, filed the following day, lasted approximately 15 minutes. During that time, Colpoys transmitted updates to 47 landing craft groups that had departed Portsmouth Harbor. The standoff ended when Admiral Ramsay himself arrived at the station. Admiral Ramsay's arrival at Portsmouth Signal Station at 2,200 hours on June 5th was documented by multiple witnesses. His first action, recorded in the station log, was to dismiss the military police. His second was to contact General Eisenhower directly. The conversation between Ramsay and Eisenhower is not preserved in official records, but the outcome is documented in SHAEF communication orders issued at 2,215 hours that night. The radio silence order was modified. Naval signal stations were authorized to transmit on civilian maritime frequencies using non-standard protocols for the purpose of maintaining contact with landing craft during channel crossing. Eisenhower's decision, analyzed in the official U.S. Army history cross-channel attack by Gordon Harrison, reflected recognition that rigid adherence to operational security protocols could compromise the invasion, more than flexible response to developing conditions. Colpoys' unauthorized frequency system became official policy 45 minutes after military police had attempted to arrest him. The immediate effect was measurable. Between 2,215 hours on June 5th and 0200 hours on June 6th, Portsmouth Signal Station logged 247 communications with landing craft groups crossing the channel. Royal Navy records archived in a DM 199-1668 document the content of these transmissions. At 2,340 hours, minesweepers detected an unexpected German minefield off the Cotentin Peninsula. The discovery was transmitted to following landing craft groups, which altered course to avoid the mines. Without radio communication, those landing craft would have entered the minefield. At 0045 hours, weather conditions deteriorated fast. Wind speeds reached 4.6. Wave heights exceeded 8 feet. Landing craft groups became separated from their escort destroyers. Radio communications allowed them to maintain formation and coordinate positions despite reduced visibility. At 0130 hours, German E-boats were detected approaching the eastern flank of the invasion fleet. Radio warnings allowed escorts to intercept before the E-boats reached the vulnerable landing craft. Each of these incidents, documented in official after-action reports preserved at the National Archives and Imperial War Museum, represented a potential disaster prevented by radio communication that violated the original operational plan. But the most critical transmission came at 0245 hours. Supreme Commander Eisenhower, monitoring weather conditions from Southwick House, faced a decision. Updated forecasts indicated that conditions would worsen through the morning. Wave heights at the beaches might exceed the operational limits for landing craft. Eisenhower's options, as documented in his personal diary archived at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, were limited. The invasion could proceed as planned, or it could be delayed, with troops remaining aboard transports in deteriorating weather for another 24 hours or longer. Either choice carried enormous risk. Proceeding might result in catastrophic losses if landing craft swamped in heavy seas. Delaying would exhaust troops, consume fuel and supplies, and risk compromising operational security as thousands of servicemen remained confined aboard ships. Eisenhower decided to proceed, but he modified H-hour timing for Utah Beach by 30 minutes to account for tidal conditions. That modification required immediate communication to landing craft groups already approaching the French coast. Under the original radio silence order, such communication would have been impossible. Landing craft would have assaulted the beaches at the wrong time, missing the naval bombardment that was timed to cease precisely at A hour. Colpoys transmitted the A hour modification at 0245 hours using the civilian frequency system. The transmission reached 89 landing craft groups assigned to Utah Beach. Post-invasion analysis, conducted by the U.S. Army's Historical Division and published in Utah Beach to Cherbourg by Roland Ruppenthal, confirmed that landing craft groups received and implemented the hour change. They arrived on schedule with the modified timing, achieving surprise and coordinating with naval gunfire support. Without radio communication, those landing craft would have landed 30 minutes early. They would have assaulted German defenses without supporting fire. Casualties would have been catastrophically higher. The scale of what Colpoys' unauthorized system prevented became clear in the days following D-Day. Admiral Ramsay submitted his official report on Operation Neptune, the naval component of the invasion, on June 15, 1944. The report, preserved in a DM 199 1670, included a detailed assessment of communication procedures. Ramsay documented that landing craft groups maintained contact with command ships throughout the channel crossing. He noted that operational orders were transmitted and acknowledged in real time. He credited the communication system with preventing loss of formation integrity during deteriorating weather. Most significantly, Ramsay documented that German B-Dienst had not identified the transmissions as Allied military communications. This assessment was confirmed after the war when Allied intelligence officers examined captured German signal intelligence logs. These logs, analyzed in the official British intelligence history, showed that B-Dienst monitored the civilian maritime frequencies but dismissed the traffic as routine coastal communications. The deception had worked. Allied forces had maintained radio communication with the invasion fleet while convincing German intelligence that radio silence remained in effect. The technical success of Colpoys' frequency system led to its adoption as standard procedure for subsequent amphibious operations. U.S. Navy Communication Doctrine, updated in August 1944 and archived in Naval History and Heritage Command records, incorporated civilian frequency deception protocols for assault phase communications. These protocols were employed during operations in southern France in August 1944, the Philippines in October 1944, and Okinawa in April 1945. In each case, landing forces maintained radio contact throughout approach and assault phases while avoiding detection by enemy signal intelligence. The broader implications extended beyond tactical communications. Colpoys' system demonstrated that operational security and operational effectiveness were not always complementary. The radio silence order had been designed to protect security, but it had created tactical vulnerability that threatened the invasion's success. The lesson, documented in post-war U.S. Army and Royal Navy communication doctrine reviews, was that security measures must be balanced against operational requirements. Rigid protocols that prevented essential communication could be more dangerous than flexible approaches that accepted calculated risk. This principle influenced Allied communication planning for the remainder of the war. As for Lieutenant Commander Colpoys, the immediate consequences of his unauthorized transmissions were complex. Admiral Ramsay recommended Colpoys for commendation for initiative and technical expertise under operational pressure. The recommendation, filed on June 20, 1944, cited his role in preventing communication failures that could have compromised the invasion. But Brigadier General Lee filed a formal complaint with SHAEF regarding violation of direct orders. The complaint, preserved in National Archives reference RG 331, ARGUED that unauthorized radio transmissions had created unacceptable security risk regardless of outcome. The dispute reached General Eisenhower. His resolution, documented in his official correspondence archived at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, was characteristically pragmatic. Eisenhower declined to pursue disciplinary action. He noted that the modification to communication procedures had been necessary and effective. He stated that combat conditions required flexibility in applying operational orders. But he also reinforced that future deviations from SHAEF directives required command approval. Colpoys received no official commendation. He also received no reprimand. He continued serving as signals officer at Portsmouth until the end of the war. His unauthorized frequency systems saved lives and prevented disasters. But his recognition came decades later when historians analyzing D-Day communication records identified his role in solving a problem that operational planners had overlooked. The success of Operation Overlord depended on thousands of technical decisions made in the months and weeks before June 6, 1944. Most of those decisions were made by senior commanders and experienced planners. They were based on extensive analysis, tested in exercises, and refined through careful preparation. But some critical decisions were made by junior officers who recognized problems that planning had missed. Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Colpoys' unauthorized frequency system was not the result of brilliant foresight. It was the result of technical expertise applied to a specific problem. Landing craft radios did not have sufficient range to maintain contact during a 14-hour channel crossing. The solution was not elegant. It violated communication doctrine. It required deception. It created risk of confusion and compromise. But it worked. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Navy's Communication Systems Division, published in 1947 and archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, estimated that the civilian frequency system prevented between 40 and 60 landing craft from becoming separated from the invasion fleet during the channel crossing. Each landing craft carried approximately 35 troops. The communication system likely prevented between 1,400 and 2,100 soldiers from missing their hay-hour timing, landing on wrong beaches, or becoming isolated and vulnerable to German counterattack. These numbers are estimates. The actual impact cannot be precisely measured. But the archived records from D-Day make clear that without radio communication, coordination of the invasion fleet would have broken down during the channel crossing. The technical lesson was incorporated into Allied doctrine. The civilian frequency deception system became standard procedure for amphibious operations. The principle of flexible communication protocols replaced rigid radio silence in subsequent invasions. The human lesson was more subtle. Operational success required both adherence to plans and willingness to recognize when plans contained flaws. It required both respect for command authority and courage to act when command decisions created unacceptable risk. Colpoys chose to violate direct orders because technical analysis convinced him that following those orders would endanger the invasion. He accepted personal risk of court-martial because he judged that risk acceptable compared to operational failure. Admiral Ramsay supported that decision and defended it to Supreme Command. General Eisenhower validated it by modifying the operational order rather than punishing the violation. The unauthorized frequency system that prevented D-Day communication disaster was not the work of a single individual. It was the result of multiple officers at different levels of command recognizing a problem and accepting responsibility for solving it. That collaborative problem-solving, documented in the archived records of Operation Overlord, exemplified the adaptability that characterized successful Allied operations throughout the war. Plans were essential, but so was the judgment to modify plans when conditions demanded it.